All right, we're going to mix some things up for you a little bit this week and next week as we continue our series on In God We Trust. We've been talking about some different topics the last couple weeks and the next 2 weeks about just some things that are a little bit tough to deal with, some things that maybe as a church we have a hard time having discussions about, and so just the idea of in God we trust, because we have these discussions and we try to have these understandings, but essentially we kind of just lay them before God and say, God, in you we trust these things. And so we've had some fun discussions on Jesus and politics, and last week on Jesus and sexuality and gender identification, those kind of things we had, and marriage, and I just hit a whole ball of all together last week. And so as I went through this week, trying to decide, I have a whole list of all kinds of topics I wanted to speak on, and I really just kind of struggled this week on what do we need to hear next? What do we need to talk about next? Dan, can you make sure and close that door, please? Thank you. What do we want to talk about next? And it was a struggle all week long, to be honest with you, because I wanted to talk about, some of you want to talk about Jerusalem and Israel and the importance of that in Christian life, and especially now with all the stuff going on and end times, and then there's stuff about immigration and border and all that kind of stuff too, and I was looking into all that kind of stuff, but I just didn't feel good about any of it for today. And when it came down to it, finally Thursday evening, I kind of just said, what am I supposed to be doing here? What am I supposed to be talking about the next 2 weeks, really, is what I said to God, because I got 2 weeks that I need to still fill. And I realized that I was having a hard time because there's a little bit of a block inside of me this week. And many of you know what that block is because you felt it yourself too. That you've gone through this whether it's been this last year or it's been in years past, we all in some way deal with grief. We all deal with loss. And I've told you this over this last year about the fact that for me and Christy alone, we have lost 6 family members in the last year. People that we knew. Like it's not like a distant cousin that we hardly knew. They were people that we knew. And then we had a good friend who died shortly after Christmas. And so maybe my block this last week was because I was just having a bout of grief inside of me that Christy will tell you, I didn't want to do anything on Thursday. I was like, I need to run away for a little while. And maybe it's because I was dealing with that, and it's all built up inside of me. And you guys know, because some of you are dealing with grief right now, and if you're not right now, the unfortunate side of life is you will be. You know, I sat here on Easter Sunday morning, and I spent the week of Easter getting ready so we could have a great service together, so we could have a fun time celebrating the resurrection, and I had that tomb right here, and I had the big stone, and I moved it back and forth, right, and I talked about how sometimes God puts big stones in front of us, or the world puts big stones in front of us, and we need God's help to get it out of the way, and there I am writing a sermon about that. And on Thursday before Easter, I get the word that my mom had a massive heart attack. And then a few hours later, I get that call that says she didn't make it. And so I'm preaching to you on Easter Sunday morning about big stones that come in our way, that get there in the way, and how we need to overcome them, and how God will give us the power and the strength to overcome them, knowing that I have this huge boulder in front of me. Because what did I do? As soon as we got done with Easter service and I said goodbye to all of you, I went home, threw my stuff in my car, and I drove to Oregon for the week to spend it with my brothers, trying to figure out what to do. And so I've been thinking about that, and this week I was brought back to this sermon that I started writing back in February. I started writing about this back in February, and the sad thing is, since February, I had my mom and I had an aunt who passed away. And I said, well, I don't want to preach that. I don't want to look into that anymore. Look what happened. But here we were on Thursday night feeling like I have nothing else. And so God kind of opened the doors and said, let's get back to the sermon. And even though it's not a hot button topic like we've been talking about, grief is still something we don't talk about enough in the church. And it's something that we just kind of don't deal with as much in the church. And so I wanted to take a little opportunity today to talk about it, because we all experience loss in one form or another. It could be the loss of a loved one. It could be the loss of a job. It could be the loss of a relationship. It could be a loss of your own even self-worth and who you are. And as we go through life, those losses add up. And as those losses add up, they leave us feeling empty and broken and all alone and unsure of what's next. They all come together for those reasons. And we are left kind of wondering what to do with them. We're kind of left wondering, where do we go next? Whatever the loss looks like for you in your life, whatever that may be, we all need to search and find God through that time and find the comfort that God provides for us. And through God and through Him, we can find hope in the middle of our loss. We can find hope in the middle of that loss. And so today I just want to talk a little bit about that, about finding hope in those times of loss. That grief is one of those things that happens to everybody. It's part of the human experience. We don't like it. We don't want to go through it. And when we go through it and we think we're done with it, then all of a sudden it sneaks in again in some weird place, in some weird time. And so we constantly get reminded of it, and it just pops up in different ways. And it's one of those yucky parts of life for us. And so we struggle with it. We struggle with the emotions. We struggle looking for comfort. We look for places where we can leave our sorrows. We look for places where we can find healing in our own lives from those times of grief. And so we gather together as the church to say, let's find our hope and our comfort in God. I read a quote this week that said, "Grief is the price we pay for loving." Man, something that hit home for me. Like, grief is the price we pay for loving. So if you never want to experience grief in your life, it's time to move to an island somewhere in the South Pacific and never talk to anybody ever again. And don't have any pets, right? You can't make pets of the little fish that come around or the little birds that fly to the island either, right? You need to go isolate yourself somewhere from everything and everyone, and you'll never experience grief again. But that's not possible, nor would we be happy with that. When loss does come our way, it all depends on how we handle it and how we deal with it in order for us to be able to grow through it and be able to move on and to be able to keep doing the things that we do. All those kind of things, they come together in that way. And so it depends on how we handle it and deal with it. And we have a story in the Gospel of John where Jesus deals with grief. And hopefully we can walk through that story a little bit together this morning and kind of get that feel of how Jesus dealt with it and how the others dealt with it to help provide some of that hope in your life if you're dealing with grief today, or it can be a reminder as you deal with grief in the future. But John chapter 11, it tells us about Jesus, it tells us about Lazarus, it tells us about Martha and about Mary. And it's the story that goes there. So John 11, starting at verses 1 to 3, reads, "A certain man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sister sent word to Jesus saying, 'Lord, the one whom you love is ill.'" And so that's the beginning of the story. Jesus' good friend Lazarus is very sick, is very ill. Matter of fact, he's so sick that his sisters are worried about what's going to happen next. And so they're so worried that they want to send word to Jesus, their good friend, their trusted friend. And Jesus gets the news, and he's saddened to hear that his friend Lazarus is very sick. And he's so sad, what does he do? He stays there. He stays where he's at because he's got a job to do. He's got a project to finish. He's got something from God that he's been called to do. And so he stays there. And unfortunately, while he's there, before he can leave to go back to Bethany, Lazarus ends up dying. And Jesus is now dealing with grief over the loss of a friend. Mary and Martha are dealing with grief over the loss of a brother. Others who are there are dealing with grief as well over the loss of a friend. I'm not going to read through the whole story. We're going to jump around verses 17 to 45 as we continue to look at the story here. But it's important to look and see what Jesus does and how he interacts with them for how we can find that hope in our times of grief. And the first thing that we need to look at is we need to look at the reality of grief. Grief is a very interesting part of life. Just when you think you have a handle on grief, just when you think you have everything under control, just when you think it's all taken care of and you're able to move past it, it shows up again, doesn't it? It shows up into your life. Maybe it's not so much about the person anymore, but it's about you pass by that restaurant that you guys always ate together. Maybe it's remembering a holiday that you spent together. Maybe it's a birthday that came up. When I went to Oregon to my mom's and my brothers and I were going through all of her stuff, I was collecting all of her pictures together and put them all in a box off the top of her dresser, and she had a little bottle of perfume. And I said, look, there's mom's scent. There's my mom right there. And I could smell her perfume. That it's not always just about birthdays and anniversaries and things like that, but it's maybe seeing the hospital room that they were in. Maybe it's seeing a certain type of equipment that they had to go through. Maybe it's seeing the type of car they used to drive. All those things can bring back grief into our minds. It can remind us of those people, and then we feel that sadness, that grief within us once again. And that's the hard part about grief, is that it just continues to come around and come around on us. When it comes to handling grief, most counselors say there's 3 steps to grief. Now, they like to go up like 5 or 6 steps, but I brought it down into 3 basic steps for us today. The first step is the crisis stage. That is when we get that awful news, when that shock gets set in. I can't believe that this has happened kind of mentality jumps into us. We might deny it. We might start crying uncontrollably or screaming out. We are in some kind of emotional distress because this has now happened and it's right in front of us and it feels like our world has suddenly started falling apart. This, unfortunately, is the most painful stage, the most painful part of it as it all settles in and as it all comes together. And so we have that first crisis stage. The second stage is called the crucible stage. It's when we begin to deal with the tragedy of this death in our life. That anger likes to show up in this place, and anger likes to build up inside of us, and unfortunately then it likes to come out of us, and we like to blame people and circumstances and places. I thought about my mom, and my mom's dad, he died of cancer. He worked his whole life at a paper mill in Camas, Washington, and he died of cancer, and my mom always had bitter feelings about the paper mill. That's where he got the cancer. If he didn't work there, he wouldn't have got cancer and wouldn't have died so young. And I'm like, it had nothing to do with the pipe he smoked all the time? It had nothing to do with the cigars he always had? Like, cancer comes from all kinds of places. And he was a heavy tobacco user all of his life. It didn't come from those places. But that's part of this stage, is we like to blame things and blame people. And then maybe it includes times, though, where we feel an intense emotion of guilt or depression or an overwhelming sense of sadness that comes over us. The third basic stage is the rebuilding stage. We start to construct a new pattern of life, a new way of living now. Maybe we find a new job. Maybe we move. Maybe we start some new habits. Maybe we just do some different things because we're now starting a new chapter of life that moves us past who we were to something new and who we are now because we have this loss in our life. And so we move to that stage. The hard part about grief and the hard part about, we can name these stages, but there's no timetable for these stages. There's no way to say, well, this is, all right, well, it's been 3 weeks, you should be into the next stage now. All right, come on, it's been 4 weeks, you should be out of that. There's no timetable, there's no easy pill to swallow to relieve your stress. There's no experience you can do. that can move you from one to one. That's between you and the grief and God to move through those things. Everyone experiences grief differently, and that's what makes it so challenging to deal with. We do know, though, that grief kind of builds up inside of us. It's kind of like when you take hot water and you put it in a kettle and you put it on a heat source. You have to have some kind of vent for as the water heats up inside that kettle, it has to have ability for the steam to come out, or else the steam and the pressure builds up inside of it, and then bad things happen, right? And grief is kind of like that. It builds up inside of us, and if we don't find a way to properly vent, a proper way to let that grief go, a proper way to deal with it, then it's going to build up inside of us, and then some poor, unsuspecting cashier at Town Pump who just asked you how your day is going is going to find out how your day is going, right? And we've seen people like that, or maybe we've been people like that at times, where we're not ourselves because it's all built up and it has to come out somewhere. And we see that in the story of Jesus with Mary and Martha, that as he gets back to the town, he comes 4 days later, he gets back to the town, and Mary and Martha are there and they're grieving, and he's first greeted by Martha. And Martha comes out to him. He's not even into the town yet. He's not even into their home yet. And she comes running out to him, and she has these words to say to him. Verse 21 says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And then after she talks to Jesus a little bit, she goes back to the house, and then Mary comes out, and Mary says the same thing in verse 32. These are women who love Jesus. These are women who are close to Jesus, who follow Jesus, who believe and trust Jesus. Yet the grief inside of them just has built up, and when Jesus finally returns, it just pours out into criticism of Jesus, into maybe anger towards Jesus. Why didn't you come sooner? We told you to come sooner. You could have taken care of him. You could have handled this. And it just kind of builds up in front of them. They blame him for Lazarus' death. Because sometimes it's just easier to blame others. Sometimes it's easier just to blame people. Sometimes it's easier to question our choices. Sometimes it's easier to say, oh, we could have done this or that. And in reality, this is life. And life, things happen around us. And so instead of letting those things build up inside of us and come bursting out, we need to find ways to vent that out and be able to seek what we need. And so the second thing we're looking at today is the fact that what we need is Jesus. And Jesus understands our grief. That Jesus understands that these women have come to him and they're expressing their grief. He understands that in the midst of their crying, in the midst of their sadness, in the midst of all that's going on, that they are really just speaking out of turn. That they're speaking out of character for how they normally are. So it must be the grief that is coming out. We can read this story and realize that Jesus is also a man who comes to this situation grieving. He has come into this situation because he's grieving his close friend. That's why he's there. If Jesus wasn't grieving Lazarus, he would have moved on to the next town. He would have just continued on with his journey with all the things that he was doing, teaching and miracles and all that. But because Lazarus was important to him, he came back to be a part of the ceremonies for Lazarus. Jesus is a close personal friend. He had a fondness for their company. He spent time with Lazarus and his sisters. He spent time in their homes. He had meals with them. They shared laughter. They shared stories. They probably cried over other things together. They talked about the kingdom of God. They spent lots of time together, and it says that Jesus, was a close friend. I find it interesting that when at the beginning, the opening verses I read, that it says that they are supposed to say, Lord, the one whom you love is ill. You realize in the Gospel of John, that's only said about one other person. It's usually how John identifies himself, right? The one that Jesus liked the most, right, is me. It's John. So it's interesting that even through all this, that tells you how close he was with Lazarus and with the sisters. And so he's close to them. But hear me, Jesus didn't delay coming because he didn't care about Lazarus. Jesus didn't delay in his actions because he figured, well, they'll just take care of themselves. Jesus delayed in his actions because there were greater things involved with God, and he had to do those things. The sisters are left wondering, they're left questioning, why weren't you here, Jesus? You could have saved him. Why didn't you do something about it? They laid the blame on him for Lazarus dying. But Jesus didn't delay coming because he didn't care. And that's part of grief, though, is those questions. Why didn't you come? God, why didn't you do something about this? Why didn't you provide? Why didn't you open the door sooner? Why didn't you? And we put all those questions out there. And that's part of grief, and that's part of processing for us. We can be like the sisters and ask those questions at Jesus. The problem is that sometimes we allow those questions to get in the way of hearing from God. We allow those questions to separate us and go, well, now I'm angry at God. We like to say, I blame God for this. He could have done something. He could have. And we allow it then to blame God and separate ourselves and think that he doesn't care and he doesn't understand. He's done it before. He's healed people before. Why couldn't he heal now? Why couldn't he do this now? Why couldn't he provide for me now? And it's okay. God created us to ask questions. But the problem is that questioning can either draw us closer to God, or it can create anger and bitterness and draw us away not only from God, but from other people as well. Notice that what happens is that the sisters ask these questions of Jesus, and Jesus lets them. He understands the grief they're going through, and he's going through the grief as well. But notice the sisters don't kick at him. They don't yell and scream violently at him. They don't disavow Jesus. They don't say, that's it, you didn't come back, so I'm done following you. No, they express themselves, and then they listen to Jesus' response. They followed Jesus' leading. They sat there and they cried before him. And we know that he cries with them. And I always like to imagine in this story that Jesus was hugging them as well, was trying to find a way to comfort them, saying, yeah, I know this is hard. I know. But I just don't know what to say, so here. And he cries with them, and he hugs them, and he sits with them. And then notice what happens in verses 33 and 34. It says, when Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. He asked, where have you laid him? They replied, Lord, come and see. In this passage, we see that many friends have come and gathered around Mary and Martha. There are many who have come to help them grieve, who have come to help them celebrate Lazarus' life and to be there with them. And they are crying as well, and they are feeling lost. And then they see that Jesus shows up, and he also is crying. It startles them so much that John records that their response to him crying is, see how much he loved him. See how much that he loved him. Now, death isn't part of God's plan. When God created Adam and Eve and created all of creation, he didn't include death to be in there. Death came because of sin in the world. Because sin has consequences that lead to death. That disobedience from God leads to death. But God did not plan for that to be part of it until sin entered the world. And so when we grieve and when we feel that loss, Jesus cries with us. Jesus hurts with us. And Jesus hurts for us as we grieve. He can't do anything about it because sin has its consequences. Until we get to the end times, which I know many of you are counting down the clock because things have really spiraled the last year. But until we get to the end times, Jesus has to wait as well. But while he waits, he sits and he cries with us and he cries for us. And then number 3, Jesus brings hope into our grief. Jesus goes to Bethany to see Lazarus after Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Jesus talks to Mary and Martha briefly, and he quickly asks, where has Lazarus been laid to rest? And then verse 35 says, Jesus began to cry. Why does he want to see the tomb? Why is he crying? He's crying over the death of a friend. He's crying over the pain in the hearts of the sisters. He's crying over the death that has occurred. And he's crying not just because of this death, but we know what Jesus must do. We know that Jesus has to die for all. Jesus is crying over all the death that has to occur. He's crying with you in your grief. He's crying with me in my grief. He's crying with all of us, and he's in pain with all of us as we are in pain. The death brings into focus the reason why Jesus had to come. And this is the first kind of recorded incident where Jesus is there with a close friend who has died. It brings into focus why Jesus had to come to earth. That Jesus had to come because sin created death in a way that God did not intend, that God had not planned. And the last enemy of sin, the last enemy that Jesus has to defeat while he's on earth, he has to overcome death. He uses his power to overcome death for us, to give us new life. Jesus gives us a glimpse of this. He has that interaction with Martha about life and the resurrection, right? John 11, back up to verses 25 and 26, says, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Now, don't get us wrong here, because some of the disciples, some of the apostles kind of thought some of Jesus' language meant that they wouldn't die before Jesus returned for the second coming. Jesus isn't saying that believers will never die, that we'll never have this physical death. But what he's saying is that we have a life that is given to us through Jesus Christ that transcends the physical death that we see around us, the physical death that occurs on this earth. It is a new life that we begin to experience on this earth, and then we say goodbye to this earth, and it continues past that physical death into that eternal glory, into that eternal life that God created for us to experience and for us to be reunited with those who believe in Jesus. That because of the death that Jesus experienced on the cross, that God's grace and love are available to us now and into the future. That we are not someday we will get heaven, someday we will get God's kingdom, someday we will get God's love. But it's now we have the availability to speak in and receive that life-giving, spiritual life-giving that God has for us because of Jesus, his grace and his love and his peace that comes to us, that we can experience now and into the future. That even in the midst of our grief, even in the midst of our time of sadness, even in the midst of all that is going on around us, we have a hope for the future. We have a hope for the way that we live this life, that we have this time where we have to say more of a temporary goodbye than a permanent goodbye. We have that hope that Jesus gives us, that eternal life. They take Jesus to the tomb to see Lazarus. They take him to that tomb and say, here's where we have laid him. And in verse 39, Jesus tells them, well, remove the stone. Remove the stone. I want to see his body. And of course, the sisters are like, Lord, he's been dead a few days. Bodies don't smell great after they've been dead a few days. You probably don't want to do that. And Jesus says, no, I do want to do that. I want you to roll that stone away. And he plans to do something that he hasn't done before. And he plans to do something to demonstrate them the power that he has over death. The power that he will demonstrate to us on Resurrection Sunday. The hope that there's more to come than just this physical death that we have in front of us. It's a taste of what is to come. Verses 43 and 44. Having said this, Jesus shouted with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his feet bound and his hands tied and his face covered with a cloth. And then Jesus, of course, tells them to unwrap him. He's alive. Let's go. Let's welcome him back. With Lazarus and with his own death, Jesus doesn't abolish this physical death from happening. It's not time for that. At the end of creation, when all is done at the end times, that's when it's time for that. And so unfortunately, grief is still a reality for us. Pain is not forgotten. But now we have hope in Jesus Christ. A hope that he demonstrates by bringing Lazarus back from the dead. A hope that he demonstrates to us that when he rises from the dead on Easter morning and is resurrected, that he has the power to do what he says. And he has the power to give us that life. And so Jesus cries over Lazarus because he's grieving. Jesus cries with Mary and Martha. Jesus cries with you where you're at in your grief and in your time. Jesus is by your side saying, I'm sorry. I can't do anything about this right now. But I give you this hope and this love and this peace that will help you through it. Grief is painful, but Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. He brings that hope into our grief. Being the resurrection, being the life, brings that hope into us. That is a life that is after the loss. That we must be wrapped around the grace and peace of Jesus and keep his hope at the center of our lives so we can continue moving forward. So when grief shows up and when grief creeps in, we can say, yes, I am saddened. Yes, I am grieving. But I also know that, yes, Jesus gives me more than what I see around me. And that it may be hard, but I can overcome this because Jesus gives me the power and the strength to do it. And because Jesus has done it before and he will continue doing it past us until the end times. There is hope in your loss. Whatever that grief is that you're feeling, all we're asked to do is to bring it to Jesus. Just bring it to him and tell him about it. And it's okay to yell at him sometimes. It's okay to scream about it. After all, he's a God who created us with those emotions. He created us to be beings that express ourselves, that question and that get frustrated and angry and all those things. He asks us, he says, go ahead, bring those to me, but also be open to me, to the fact that I am right here, ready to give you some peace, ready to wrap my arms around you, ready to cry with you, ready to help you through this time. And so this morning, we're going to have a little bit of an extended reflection time, because I didn't want to just talk about grief and then say, oh, go away now, right? But I want to have some time for you to let that sink in a little bit. And so we have a short video, and then the worship team's going to lead us in a couple songs. And I want you to feel like you can just respond in whatever way God may be speaking to you this morning. I'm going to give you a couple opportunities. We have these two boards here, and there's pens by them. Maybe in a prayer of handing something over to God, you just want to come up and write one word on the board. Write one word that represents a grief for you. And you write it up there, and it's a way of saying, God, please help me with this. Or Lord, help me to overcome this. And maybe it's a simple word like cancer, or heart attack, or job, or housing. Maybe it's something like that you're grieving, and you can just put one word. And so maybe if you feel like it, that's one way to have a prayer. One of the other ways this morning is if you want to come up to the altar, and it's kind of like the old Catholic way but we're not praying for our lost people who have passed on already. They have already passed. But maybe it's an honor of, you know what, I'm dealing with grief over the loss of my mom. And so I'm just going to light a candle. Hopefully you flip the switch, light the candle, and just say a prayer. God, help me in honor of my mom to as I deal with the grief. And maybe that's whoever it is for you. Maybe there's someone and so in honor of somebody, you want to just come up and do that, but have that moment of prayer with him. We also got lots of boxes of Kleenex up here, because I know what this topic does. Maybe you need to come and just sit in the front. Maybe you need to kneel at the altars. I pulled the altars back so you can kneel on the padded part to pray, and have a little more cushion on your knees if you need to. But if maybe you need to come and pray, maybe you need to come and sit in the front rows. Maybe you need to just have that experience together while we sing these songs. Maybe you need to, I'll be sitting right here. Maybe you need to come and sit next to me and have a word with me real quick, or have me pray over you. That's fine too. But I want to give these closing moments, just that opportunity to kind of reflect and give you an opportunity to just let this settle a little bit before we leave. And so feel free. We're going to start the video in just a moment. Feel free during the video or during the songs, any of that, if you want to respond in any of these ways, feel free to. Maybe when the songs start, you want to just stand and sing, and those are your songs of prayer and praise to God this morning. Feel free, whatever that may feel like for you. Go ahead.